Over the past year, I have been obsessed with Souls-likes. It began when my friends told me about Elden Ring and was quickly followed by Bloodborne and Sekiro. I am absolutely in love with all of these games. Bloodborne in particular is one of my favorite games of all time, and I've gone as far as to platinum it. I've also bought the official art book and some comics. Needless to say, I'm a bit of a Bloodborne fiend, and one day while I was scrolling through Steam, I found a game that made me go, hey, that kinda reminds me of Bloodborne. From the pictures and trailer, the game looked promising, so I decided to buy it, and today we're gonna talk about it. Thymesia is interesting to say the least. The first thing I'll say is, despite the aesthetic being clearly inspired by Bloodborne, the combat is closer to Sekiro with a focus on deflection, but comparing it to Sekiro is like comparing Yandere Simulator to Hitman. We'll talk more about the combat in a bit because I have a lot to say. During my playthrough, I only did the required bosses, which include the first boss who's designed to kill you, Circus Man, a giant bat, the Tower Knight, didn't he kill me earlier? And a mystery boss we'll talk about later in the video. To start off, let's talk about the overall game design of Thymesia. Levels in this game follow a very linear structure with shortcuts throughout, and are pretty much what you'd expect in a Souls-like. There's chairs scattered through each level that allow you to level up and allocate skill points through a skill tree. One thing I do like is that at any time you can reset your skills, so if you don't like the decisions you made earlier in the game or think that different skills would help with a boss, you can reallocate any time without penalty. The starting area is decent and does a good job at explaining the basic mechanics of the game, and if you've played a Souls-like before, you'll notice that it takes heavy inspiration. The level after the tutorial, though, I got some things to say. The Sea of Trees is the first zone after the tutorial, and it feels very dull with it having a yellowish haze over the entire level. Why did the devs decide to make this the first actual impression of the game? It's so dull and lifeless and doesn't do the game any favors. Honestly, any of the later levels would have made for a better first impression. The level I enjoyed most visually was the Royal Garden because it has some more diversity to its color palette, and also it kind of reminded me of Ludwig's Arena in Bloodborne.
Help us. An silent beast.
Hermes Fortress is a castle level and is very similar to something you'd find in Demon's Souls or Elden Ring. Nothing too spectacular. Oh, and by the way, this is the hub area.
Mom, can we have Hunter's Dream?
No, we have Hunter's Dream at home.
Hunter's Dream at home.
Let's talk about the combat. Combat in a Souls-like is very important since it's the main draw to even play these types of games. While this isn't a game made by From Software, I feel considering it takes heavy inspiration, it's a fair enough comparison. Overall, it feels heavily inspired by Sekiro due to it focusing on deflection, but Thymesia's combat is kind of stupid. You have your main weapon which you use to deflect and get hits on your enemy, but this only affects the armor which is represented by the white in the health bar. In order to do actual damage, you need to use your claw weapon shortly after deflecting or attacking. This is represented by the green bar which can be seen after hitting an enemy or deflecting an attack. You need to hit them with your claw in a short amount of time because the white bar will regenerate after a few seconds. I hate this for two reasons. One, the way the combat is designed makes your main weapon feel useless since it only affects the armor an opponent has. And two, switching back and forth between your saber and claw feels very unnatural, and some enemies have a very tiny window where you can get your second claw hit in. One thing I will praise though is a cool mechanic where if you charge up your claw weapon and hit an enemy, you can get a special attack based on the weapon that the enemy was using, called a Plague Weapon. This is a one-use weapon and can be activated by pressing Y on an Xbox controller. One problem with this, however, is that once you activate the weapon, you're locked into your attack until the animation finishes, and enemies can still attack you while you're doing this. For longer animations, this can be a death sentence since you can't deflect their attacks while being locked into an animation. On top of this, Thymesia's combat overall feels very stiff and has a high learning curve. Let's compare it to Sekiro's combat. Sekiro's combat also focuses on deflection. In Sekiro, you have two ways to defeat your opponent. You can either get their health bar to 0 or max out their posture. Doing either of these will result in you performing a death blow, and once you perform enough death blows, the enemy dies. With Sekiro's combat, there's a clear reward for mastering it, since you can get to a point where you can defeat enemies very quickly without taking much damage yourself, and it feels very nice and rewarding once you get the hang of it. There is a flow to Sekiro's combat, while in comparison Thymesia's combat lacks any kind of flow to it, with having to constantly switch between weapons. The obvious way I'd fix the combat issue is to get rid of the requirement to use the claw altogether, and maybe just have it as a mechanic for gathering special plague weapons and doing extra damage. If they want to stick to the combat design that the game currently has, at least allowing the ability to combo your saber and claw would help the combat feel much better and add a reward for mastering it. Let's talk about bosses. There's a total of 4 bosses that are required to beat the game, and they're at least somewhat enjoyable. Odur is the first boss of the game and is very hard for a first boss. The first phase isn't too bad, but he has a ton of BS in his second phase. Even being someone who is very familiar with Sekiro's combat, I still had a tough time with him. I feel like Odur would have made a better late game boss due to the high difficulty, because at this point, most players are probably still getting used to the combat, but hey, I'm not a game designer. The Hanged Queen feels like something straight out of Bloodborne with its Vicar Amelia style healing mechanic and music that sounds very similar to Cleric Beast. Take a listen.
Mom, can we have Cleric Beast?
No, we have Cleric Beast at home.
Cleric Beast at home.
The fight wasn't nearly as hard as Odur, since the moveset isn't extremely hard to get down, though it does have one BS attack. The boss I enjoyed most was Varg, who is the third boss of the game. This fight is the only fight that felt good because while it was challenging, it worked well with the combat style the game went for, and at this point in the game, I had grown accustomed to Thymesia's combat. Also, fun fact, you can actually defeat Varg in the tutorial and get an achievement for doing so. He still kills you though. The final boss I have some things to say about. Would you have guessed that the final boss of the game is you? This fight is basically you versus the tryhard who gathered all the weapons and mastered the combat. Granted, I was probably underpowered for this fight since I only did the main bosses that are required to beat the game. I don't know much about the lore of this game because I didn't care to pay attention, but this feels like lazy writing. Poor writing aside, this is a very hard fight and definitely the hardest in the game. Your alternate self has a diverse amount of weapons and allows very little room for error. Not to mention he has 2 phases, though phase 2 doesn't have a huge difficulty spike unlike Odur. This fight alone took me about 2 hours, and the entire time I was asking, why am I fighting myself? Would you like to know how the game ends? Before I tell you, let me ask you something. What is the worst way to end a Souls-like? I'll give you a few seconds. That's right, a pop quiz. Could you imagine if FromSoft had a pop quiz at the end of one of their games? What were the devs thinking? This is a Souls-like. You don't play it for the lore. You look up the lore after finishing the game, because watching an hour-long video about the hidden lore you missed is a rite of passage. Go check out this video on Bloodborne, by the way. It's amazing. If the devs wanted you to pay attention to the story, then they should have at least had something to make you realize that it's important. The devs really said, hope you were taking notes. Here's your pop quiz. Your answers determine the fate of everything, so I hope you studied. Something I noticed while reviewing footage for this video is that the bosses have dialogue while you fight them. How do you expect me to pay attention to this while I'm trying to not die? There's no voice acting, so how is anybody supposed to notice this? I only noticed because I decided to make a video about this game. At the end of the day, Thymesia is an okay game. It has its moments, and if you want a challenging Souls-like, here you go. If you do decide to try this game, I'd buy it while it's on sale. It's at least somewhat worth a try for the challenge, and I'd love to hear what you think if you played the game yourself. And if anybody knows anything about the lore, I'd love to know what happened. I think this Steam comment describes the game best.
If Bloodborne and Sekiro had a baby but the baby was born without arms, legs, eyes, or ears.
I hope you enjoyed my video on Thymesia. If you did, be sure to subscribe. I also stream on Twitch every now and then, and I would love to see you there. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a good day, and I will see you soon.